you wouldn't have a game if you didn't have rules. You can't play baseball if you don't have rules of baseball. You can't play basketball if you don't have rules of basketball. These games don't exist, right? So in any part, in every aspect of society, having rules actually helps us have the freedom to do what it is that we want to do. And so it's the same thing with the money, right? If we're just willy-nilly printing money and we have the freedom to print and do whatever we want, right? We have absolute chaos. But when we have responsibility with our money, because our money is sound and our money is going to provide for us for many, many generations, right? We have rules around how we store our money and what we do with our money and how we're going to save and spend and where we're going to put it and what we're thinking about in terms of what we need now versus what we need later, right? All of a sudden we have all of this freedom that opens us up to actually having the life that we want to have.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming by for another episode of the Ben Wehrman podcast. I appreciate you being here. Today we have Morgen Rochard, who is a financial planner at Origin Wealth Advisors, a Bitcoin consultant at Money Owners, and author of Personal Finance Quick Start Guide. Did I get all those pieces correctly? I know there's so many things that you're doing. It's hard to keep track of them all.
You got them all. Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here, Morgan. Really appreciate you coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. I'm happy to be here.
So you are a Bitcoin financial advisor, which is a very rare breed out there these days. I haven't talked to a ton of financial advisors, but I know that you are certainly a black sheep among that profession. So why don't you tell me a little bit about your backstory, how you got into the financial world in general, maybe just your education, your career, and how Bitcoin ended up coming into that?
Yeah, sure. So like every good financial advisor, I started my studies in medicine. So I thought I wanted to be a doctor. And it turns out that I'm a little bit of a germaphobe, must be the Jewish side in me. And so like I was volunteered at a hospital. They asked me to change bed sheets. And I was like, I can't do this. I quit after one day. And then I proceeded to change what I was doing with my life. I started taking economics classes and thinking about other things. I thought it would be like really cool to trade commodities. But I never actually ended up getting into that. I ended up getting a job actually as a coffee girl on the floor of the American Stock Exchange back when that existed. And I literally did that. I got men coffee while they were yelling in pits, and they promoted me, thank God. And then I was one of the people yelling in a pit. It's not really good for my character, I'll be honest. I'm not really a yeller and screamer. And I also freeze sometimes when people ask me to do math on the fly. Like, I feel like I can normally do math, but when I'm under pressure, all of a sudden it's like, I don't know, 2 + 2, it's probably 8, you know? So obviously you can't do that when you're screaming in a pit and you have to like get it right on the spot. So I wanted to move into something also that was kind of more my personality where I can actually help people. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to get into medicine to begin with, was because I wanted to help people. And so when you're just, kind of pushing paper around and making markets and providing liquidity, that to me didn't feel that meaningful. Not to say that other people don't find meaning in it, and I'm not trying to offend anyone in any way. Just for me personally, it wasn't my calling. And so I ended up taking a job in wealth management, working for a very large private wealth team at Merrill Lynch. And I really liked what I was doing. I just didn't necessarily like where I was doing it or who I was doing it for. And I didn't know that there was kind of another world out there, in all honesty. And so I ended up switching to a different team, and we moved to UBS. And at that point I was like, okay, all of these places are just the same, I guess. Like maybe this isn't the right place for me. And then in order to start my business, is kind of silly and stupid, which is why I know like God has sort of led me in the right direction, because nobody makes this kind of business decision. I heard from a friend of mine who I didn't think was all that competent that he was starting his own business providing financial advice. And I was like, you're good. Okay. Like if you're going to do that, certainly I can do that. And so at 28, I basically started my own business. And yeah, 11 years later, here we are. So but along the way, like I have always been a libertarian and interested in sound money, was a gold bug for many years until I actually learned about Bitcoin. And when I first learned about Bitcoin, it was very exciting, but I couldn't figure out a way to like buy it without getting myself into some sort of seedy corner situation in New York. And I didn't feel that comfortable with Mt. Gox with like my traditional financial background. So I just didn't think about it. And left it alone. And then when I met my now husband, Pierre Rochard, he brought it up on our first date, of course, because why wouldn't he? And I was like, oh yeah, I remember reading about that thing,
Wait, tell us about the dating profile.
Yeah.
That's what I need to hear.
So Pierre was living in San Antonio at the time, and I was living in New York, and I wasn't having much luck dating. And I had put on my dating profile a quote from Rothbard. I don't exactly remember the quote, but it said Murray Rothbard on my profile. And he was curious if there was anyone nationally who knew anything about any of his favorite economists. So he typed Rothbard into like the search function, and he found just me. Uh,
Amazing. And probably still the only, like, has there ever been another woman to put that in there? I don't
Probably
think so. Not
not. I
nearly
don't
enough.
think so, honestly. I don't think so. So yeah, so again, meant to be. I feel like a lot of the things when I look back on life, I was like, there's definitely God's hand in everything, because there's no way I could have ended up where I am today just by my own accord. So thankfully, that's the way that it went. And so yeah, I wouldn't say though, I wouldn't call myself a Bitcoin maximalist when I first learned about it. I thought it was interesting. I thought it's something that could become something. But I actually tend to be like more pragmatic in general about things, and like to kind of wait and see what's going to happen. I'm not as visionary as my husband is. Like my husband right off the bat saw it as like, this is the future. I'm not that kind of person. It takes me like more time. I'm the kind of person that like dips your toe into the pool to see if it's cold or not, and then I'm like, okay, I'll go into my ankles. I'm like that. And so it took me actually several years. It took me 3 years to really be where I am, like sort of more, I guess, with high conviction on Bitcoin. So from like 2013 to 2016, I was interested in it. I understood it, but I didn't like fully grasp, I guess. It really took me a full 3 years. And so I think that people, when they often see our story specifically, they're like, oh, you just have to get yourself, a wife, you tell her on her first date, like about Bitcoin, and then she's orange pilled, and then it's all going to work out for you, and that's not really that, like, that's not the truth. The reality is that like, for some people, yeah, it clicks immediately, and then all of a sudden they're Bitcoin maxi. For other people, it could take a long period of time before they have that kind of same conviction. And so I guess to all those out there who are searching for a loved one who's into Bitcoin, like, be patient, I guess, is my advice.
And I do have to just ask that, because you are part of a true Bitcoin family, and you guys, that Rothbard in the dating profile story is absolutely hilarious. My question would be to you, like, why are there not more women out there that are really these hardcore libertarian types? Everyone knows that, whether it's PC or not to say it, there are just more men that are kind of into this. So how come there aren't more women, and how can we get more of them on board with this mindset?
Yeah, so I don't, again, not trying to offend people, but I do think it's more in women's nature to be compassionate, and that it's a challenge actually for men to be compassionate, and because of that, men actually need to do more work to be compassionate. And so in some regards, right, like, women are blessed because they have that in their nature, and they can care for others, and they can see beyond themselves, and just by nature we're a little less self-centered. That's not like a blanket statement, right? I know plenty of women that are super self-centered. I know lots of men that are really compassionate and care about others, right? In general, though, right, when you take a group of women, they're more likely to be more compassionate and less, less self-centered about what they're doing versus men. And so I think from that standpoint, right, if you look at women as women are people who generally are givers and want to help and all the things, and right, and get something out of that compassion, right, then from that standpoint, from a political standpoint, it's like, okay, then from there, you have to decipher the difference between what it actually means to be compassionate, like truly compassionate, and how you can help folks, rather than on the surface level of what's compassion, right? Because on the surface level, yeah, we want to help everybody. I want everyone to have everything that they need all the time, right? I would love for, people to have clean water and good food to eat, and everything's like equal, right? So not equal is maybe not the right word, but equitable, right? But how to actually do that is a layer deeper. And, and taking the time to actually think about the next layer requires some sort of interest in actually wanting to deal with that, rather than kind of some more surface level problems, like on the day to day versus the deeper level that women might get into in their own lives and careers and so forth. So that's what I think, why it's a little bit easier for men to gravitate more towards these like anarcho-capitalist type political views, is because, like, just by nature, they're not as like inclined to be as helpful right off the bat.
Moral of the story: put more Austrian economists in your bio, and you will find a top quality man out there for all the ladies listening. Pierre Rochard is just a stud. Everyone in Bitcoin knows him. I got to meet him when I was in Austin. I didn't get to meet you, but I went to all the Austin meetups I could, and he was always around just chatting with people, and just the coolest guy.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, he's the best, obviously.
So let's look at the current. We love to use this word fiat. as sort of the encapsulation of the current financial system where you've got the banking and the money printers and just these trillions of dollars being thrown around everywhere. How do you explain, like when you're going through the orange pilling process to a client or a friend or a family member, how do you explain to them what this fiat financial paradigm really is, how it works, sort of to lay the foundation for where we're working right now in the current modern world?
Yeah, I guess like in regards to orange pilling, I always like to start and see where the person actually is because some people are just kind of closed off to it and you can't have this kind of discussion, right? And so if that's the case, then there's kind of no point and I don't even bother, honestly. When people are inquisitive and curious and want to learn, right, at that point, like you have an open door. And I think that it's a lesson really in general for people, whether you be in the Bitcoin world or not. To just be open to ideas that other people have, even if you know in your heart that they're totally wrong, right? Like we can always find some sort of common ground, I think, with others, and it often like it leads us to being very divided in general and makes it a lot more difficult to have these conversations. So, like, imagine that you're like on two different peaks of a mountain, right? Like you're on peak in the east side and somebody else is on peak on the west side, right? Like at some point there's a valley that you both connect to. Right, it may be really really far away and it may not be that interesting in the valley and it may not be all that important really, right? But at the end of the day the valley does connect these two mountains, right? And so I think that if we have that part in our mind, then you can always find some kind of common ground with people, and it might not necessarily be the fiat story that right off the bat that Bitcoiners like to say, you know, about like what the government is doing to our money and how like there's all this corruption and people are messing with it and you want to be outside the system, right? I think a lot of these things, they might be fringe views for the average person. Whereas, you know, just talking about like somebody going to the grocery store and what they're experiencing, like that might be a good entry point depending on who you're talking to. So I think like the number one thing that I always tell people is that you have to understand who you're talking to, understand whether or not they're even open to hearing your ideas, and then also just see where they're coming from. Because if you understand where they're coming from, then you have some sort of entry point into talking about what Bitcoin is, because the reality is that money touches almost everything in our lives, right? And so there's always some sort of entry point where you can find some kind of common ground where money has probably been manipulated in some way in something that is important to somebody else. And from there, you can actually have the discussion.
Yeah, and speaking of those entry points where people have something that resonates with them, I feel like pretty much everyone is feeling the effects of inflation, even if they don't really understand what it is or the underground mechanics that are causing everything to get more expensive. So, how do you explain inflation to people that are just starting to wake up and ask these correct questions?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question. So, one of the things that I found really interesting in my practice, which is sort of kind of a side note to your question, then I'll get to like the inflation question itself, was that all of a sudden we started seeing asset prices creeping up, and all of a sudden everything started looking really rosy. Like financial pictures for people that in the past we were like, oh, I'm not really sure, or like you're gonna have to retire around 65, you know, based on what we were doing. All of a sudden, like the numbers would drop from 65 to like 63, and then 60, and then 59, and you're like, oh wow, you know, they're really doing well, they're saving quite a lot. We saw a lot of this happen like in the COVID basically, and then obviously like when COVID like markets crashed, like that wasn't the case, and then markets recovered really quickly because we started printing money and asset prices had inflation again. But then when we got consumer price inflation, which came after that, right, all of a sudden all the numbers started to tick back up again. And I remember this being like sort of really deeply being ingrained in my mind of like, okay, when things start to get really, really rosy in financial pictures, like we actually really need to fully assess what's going on in the client's picture and not just look at these numbers head on. Like we need to really go back and reassess like what savings rates were, where they're spending money and so forth, what categories can potentially be affected, and taking more of a deep dive so that we're not necessarily giving the rosy picture so quickly off the bat, right? Because if you have to flip from the rosy to the less rosy, right, people obviously get upset. And so that I think is sort of like, in my mind, really set the stage though. Like consumer price inflation is something that people feel very, very quickly, right? When all of a sudden you used to go to the grocery store and spend $100, and now that for the same basket of groceries you're spending $200, or if you're paying attention to prices and your milk used to cost $5 and now it costs $7.50, right? These are things that people notice, and that are undeniable, right? Like when Bitcoiners say like, oh, the government's messing with your money and they're printing money and they're doing this and that, but if you don't necessarily see it other than like your 401k is going up, There's a very big difference between asset price inflation, where people are excited, and consumer price inflation, where people are really feeling the pain. And so I feel like right now, specifically, just given everything that's going on, right, I think people had a lot of high expectations about Trump being able to lower inflation. But realistically, I think that, there's a lot of things that are good that he is doing, right? And I'm not discounting any of that, but the reality is that he's really not going to be able to lower consumer prices back to where they were prior to all of this happening, right? Maybe he can kind of stifle the growth of inflation, but we're never going to have deflation, right? Where all of a sudden your eggs are going to cost like $5 like they used to, right? And so like we're now living in this new normal where people need to be aware of like, okay, there are direct effects to like fiat intervention that are going to really impact what happens to me and my family and what goes on my table and what I'm able to afford and what I'm able to do for my children and so forth, right? Because there's a trickle effect, right? If all of a sudden people's grocery budgets explode and they're spending twice as much on groceries, like maybe now they're not sending their kids to basketball practice anymore, right? Maybe now they're not able to send their kids to a school that they otherwise would have chosen. Maybe they don't go on a vacation anymore, right? Like, or maybe they just rack up tons of debt because they don't know what else to do and they're not really good at their managing their finances. So there's a lot of just different effects that happen to people as a result of fiat inflation, and that are really easy to pinpoint depending on like who the person is and what you actually know about them.
And I'm glad you brought up the Trump thing, because you can just see that every time the metronome of left and right just flips back and forth, they're always pointing at, oh, the inflation is so bad because the bad man is there. We're going to fix it. We're going to bring down your inflation. And then it doesn't happen. It just, it may be the best that you can get is it slows down and how much worse it's getting.
Yeah, for sure. And because they always use percentage numbers, they don't actually use actual numbers for things. So like I love when people use the weight example, because they'll be like, okay, if I weigh 200 pounds, right? I don't weigh 200 pounds, but imagine there's a person that weighs 200 pounds, right? Okay, so if I gain 50 pounds, right? Now I'm 250 pounds. And then I tell you that growth has slowed, right? That still means I'm going from 250 and working my way to 300. That doesn't mean that I've all of a sudden lost weight and I'm back down to 200, right? And so I feel like that like puts it into perspective for people when they're hearing things like, oh, well, inflation's at 8%, but now it's back down to 4%. It's like, okay, before it was growing at 8% and now it's only growing at 4%, but it's still growing, right? And so the reality is that things are still going to be more expensive depending on your basket of goods. And so for some people, yeah, it might only be 4%, but for other people, depending on what they're actually spending money on, the things that people most want to spend money on in general are like, because of the way that they do CPI in the basket of goods, they're not weighted in the way that people actually can like get any value out of. And so like you might end up having a personal inflation rate of 30% depending on what you're spending money on, whereas somebody else might have a much lower inflation rate depending on what their basket of goods looks like. And so that part of it is also really important. Like for instance, like people in the Bitcoin community, I think are hit pretty hard, right? Meat prices went up quite a lot. If you're only eating meat and you're living in the Bitcoin community and like all of a sudden your grocery bill didn't probably like more than doubled, right? And so it looks very different depending on like what people are spending their money on.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up multiple points there that really highlight how inflation just lowers people's quality of life in so many areas. It sort of forces you, or a lot of people, unless you're crazy like us Bitcoiners and you will only eat meat, you're just going to keep eating it even if it's more expensive. It forces you to change your basket of goods to lower quality things and have a lower quality life. You get a worse place to live, you eat worse food, you decide not to have kids, like you lower everything around you because it just gets harder to afford it. So, but it happens so slowly for most people, or currently happening slowly. It could take off like any time here, I think. But, even though we haven't hit that true hyperinflation yet, it's still just grinding lower and lower. And this is why we see this sort of frog in a boiling water situation where you can just look around and just tell that you can even just sense that people's mental health is declining every year. And, it's just people seem like they're struggling more and more. They're getting less and less quality inputs. Their health is deteriorating, and it's all really just comes down to fiat money.
Yeah,
Would
for
you agree
sure.
that that pretty much is the root of the problem here?
Yeah, I think so, honestly. And then, I mean, the other problem with it is that if the government is printing money, the government is basically deciding, okay, what we're spending money on is more important than what you are choosing to spend money on, right? Like, that's what the government is saying in and of itself. And so people need to internalize that. That's really hard for, I think it's a lot easier of a sell now that, like, a lot of people just lost trust in the system after many, many years of being lied to, and then ultimately ending with this inflationary bubble, right? And so I think it's a lot easier of a sell to tell people this, but ultimately that is what the government is saying. They are saying, we know what's better for you and the country, and in order to do that, we think that you should just have higher prices at the grocery store because we know where the allocation of capital should be. And the reality is that we're all human beings, right? We all make mistakes, we're all fallible, and we don't actually know where money should be like allocated, especially over a large group of people, right? The United States has many, many different groups of people doing many different doing many different types of things all over the country. States in the north don't do what states in the south do. States in the east don't necessarily do what states in the west do. Whatever's going on in Alaska, I have no idea. I haven't been there since I was 15. So, like, you know what I mean? Like, we're all in this together, and yet, like, we're this big mishmash of ideas and lifestyles and so forth. And so, for the government to be able to quote unquote centrally plan that, I mean, and even to have the hubris to think that they can centrally plan that is just beyond me. It's hard enough even for, like, just a small family to be able to decide where to best allocate their capital, let alone on the level of multiple families and so forth, and millions of people. And so, and I think that, when we think about that as just families in general, right, what ends up happening is that we end up having to change on our side where we would otherwise think would be a best allocation of capital. And like you said, yeah, people are making much poorer decisions as a result of that. And it's really affecting the next generation. Like, either we've got people with mental health crises with children, right, where the children are now being affected by parents having mental health crises and so forth, and that's being passed down, and the kids have anxiety, the kids have depression, the kids have all sorts of issues. Lots of kids are on medication as a result of this, or vice versa. Parents are just not having kids because they can't afford to have them, right? And so, like, the next generation is really, really vulnerable. And, like, it pains me, right? I mean, I'm a mom of 3 kids. Like, thank God we're not affected by this, right? We live in kind of a bubble, like a Bitcoin bubble. But the more that, like, something like Bitcoin can permeate the system, where people see that they can opt out from this and that they have another way, right? The more that we can get back to making, like, really good nuclear family decisions.
I love that. And there are a bunch of pieces there I want to touch on later, especially just the family component and how Bitcoin insulates you from a lot of this stuff. That's definitely important. But I'd love to bring in just the Austrian economic side, because you're talking about how central planning and the hubris of the government to say, oh, we're going to plan all of this and we're going to have these banks that decide what the price of money is, what the inflation is, what the cost of everything is. And we go through, or at least I don't know if you did, I went through the traditional government schooling system and was taught that central banking is good for us because it's, we need them to take care of us and have the guardrails so prevent the booms and busts, and 2% inflation is a perfect number because we said so.
Yeah, yeah. I heard all that too,
and
don't worry. And I even went to private school.
yeah. So where does the Austrian School of Economics come in? You definitely have a much deeper understanding of this school of thought than I do. And I'd love to just hear how you present that as the solution and what the big ideas are from these big Austrian economists like Rothbard, Mises and all these other big names we've heard in the Bitcoin circles. How do they present the solution to this through Austrian economics, and what is it?
Yeah, so I love this question because I'm not sure actually if the solution is really the solution, and I think that we're going to get to see if it is the solution. So a lot of the solution that Austrian economists tend to propose is an insurance solution, and so it's not the way that we see insurance today, right? When we look at insurance, we think of it, like, I think of it as a giant scam, especially health insurance, where I'm just like, this is just it's very corrupt, right? And there's a lot of issues.
Just the business model of it, like, you're supposed to pay these people a bunch of money every month, and, like, they get to decide if your health event is worth it or not, and they usually say, no, here's this little fine print, like in our 300-page novel of, like, all the things that don't count. It's just like, what?
Yeah, totally. So I guess, like, because we kind of have that backdrop of insurance, when I read the Austrian economists who say basically that in a private society where you basically don't have government, or you have limited government that's basically just, like, protecting the people and providing a court system for people to actually, like, adjudicate any kind of issues that come up, right? And so Like these things obviously are very important, but then outside of that system would be basically a system of insurance, to basically through those adjudications and through legislation, not legislation, but through basically people suing each other, that insurance companies would then step in and help with some of the costs of what would happen as a result. And so people would basically, instead of paying tax dollars, would end up paying like probably pretty large premiums to insurance companies. But the idea would be that there would be a net benefit to society because there would be less going to insurance companies. Insurance companies actually wouldn't be central planning, right? They would only be basically taking that capital and then managing that risk based on the needs of the population, rather than it being like the insurance company is now deciding, okay, there's a new law and now we've created a new entity and now we're going to fund that new entity, and then that entity is going to have, like the USAID style, whatever they're going to do with this, corrupt money. And so I think that like it could obviously devolve into that depending on how the society is set up and so forth, and what the insurance companies actually do with the money or so forth. There would probably be in this, utopian anarcho-capitalist society, there would be like certain insurance companies would probably be known for bad practices versus others. And the idea would be that the free market would basically determine what insurance companies stay in business versus which ones wouldn't. And so I think it would be a different system relative to what we see today, but I don't know necessarily if it would be a perfect system either. But that is often what is brought up. I do think that there's a lot of issues with the insurance system as it currently stands, and that there's a lot that could be fixed. But there's also, like, I think when we think about Bitcoiners, we often want to throw out all the bathwater, but like you also don't want to throw the baby out, and like Bitcoiners just want to take everything out of the bath. And some of this stuff is actually good. And so I think like in a new Bitcoin world, right, we have to be sort of more discerning about, okay, what parts of the financial system and the government and so forth are actually good things that need to continue and be sustained versus what are like the parts that are totally just rotten, corrupt, and broken and that need to be removed.
That's a very interesting answer. I would have had a very different one, and I've never really even thought about that insurance side, like how that would change things. Um, the the place that I would start when I talk to people is just like the sound money angle, because that's very big in these Austrian circles. And I can't remember. I should know this. Was it Mises or someone else who had talked about the sly roundabout way that we must, find a sound form of money that can't be printed, basically. Yeah. And to me, everyone in the libertarian and anarcho-capitalist and Austrian economic school all pretty much agree we need to get rid of the Federal Reserve and have a sound form of money. And a lot of, you can see by age, basically, if they're over 40 or 50 years old, they usually say gold. And if they're under that age, they say Bitcoin.
Yeah, for sure.
And so we have Bitcoin and gold as these two options for sound money. They would essentially come in and disrupt this system that really just comes down to the central banking and the money printers.
Yeah.
So
sure.
How would you take that sort of angle where, how does inserting a form of money that cannot be printed into this equation, how does that affect all of those, the inflation and the other aspects we talked about?
Yeah, so I mean, if you have a sound money, right, and you can't print it, then you can't all of a sudden have these pet projects that you can put money towards because you have a limited supply of money. And so, like, the government in and of itself would have to be more choosy about what they did and didn't send, like, basically fund. And if they have to be more choosy, right, then at that point, either they continue to fund pet projects that are ridiculous and useless and they run out of money, right, or they take some sort of fiduciary aspect to this money, because it is the money of the government money is the money of the American people, right? It's not really their money. And so they should have more of an attitude about it. The way I would say we have an attitude about like how we help our clients with their money is that we have fiduciary standard and we act in the best interest of the client, right? And in this case, the government would have to act in the best interest of the American people because the American people is the client. And so I think it would change how government actors acted for sure. I mean, there's no way otherwise they would just, the government itself would go bankrupt, at which case I think that's like the that's the utopia I'm talking about, utopia, quote unquote, that I'm talking about, the libertarian scenarios. Like there's no more government. What happens next? And so with sound money, right, that's when the insurance, there would be like the rise of insurance is kind of what the Austrian economists have talked about, is that after the government basically goes bankrupt as a result of not actually being able to properly manage their money, this is what replaces it.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's going to be fascinating to see how this turns out, because I think you and I both agree that Bitcoin is coming whether people want it to or not, because its time has come. People are realizing that fiat money is the problem. We have a solution there. And I do love to give people the backdrop of gold. And you mentioned that you used to be a gold bug. I wouldn't say I was ever really a gold bug, but gold education was what really brought me into Bitcoin.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I've told this story on the podcast before where, I spent a few years in crypto, like most idiots do, from 2017 to 2020. And I stumbled across Mike Maloney's YouTube channel, who's a well-known gold bug out there. And he basically helped me figure out that the problem is the fiat currency.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so that helped me bridge the gap of finally understanding, okay, Bitcoin really is the thing that we need to focus. All these crypto tokens are not going to actually fix any problems. We have to focus on Bitcoin here.
Totally.
So how do you talk to people about gold and Bitcoin as these two, like the sort of the historical best sound money and the future of sound money, and how people decide which of those two would be best to put in their portfolio?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have some clients that have gold, but the reality is that most of my clients were Bitcoin only. We don't have gold. I actually don't think of gold really the way I used to, because Bitcoin I think is just such a like far superior replacement to it that it just doesn't seem even a question in my mind why you would want to hold gold over Bitcoin for sure, or even why you would want to allocate side by side, right? If you're allocating side by side, what you're doing is you're basically choosing to not put money in Bitcoin to have some money in gold. And generally, people are doing that because they're not all in, right? They're like, okay, just in case this Bitcoin thing doesn't work out, I want to at least have this other store of value gold. There are a lot of issues though with gold, right? Like gold is not divisible the way that Bitcoin is, right? Bitcoin's highly divisible. Gold, what has happened, right? And the result of why we're even in the state that we're in with fiat currency is because they stored all the gold in one place because it's really inconvenient to move around. And then they just started borrowing against it, right? And there are even gold bugs out there that say that that is their strategy. They have gold, they store it in a central location. They don't know whether or not they actually have the gold there, right? They would have to like basically melt all the gold bars to actually check whether or not each single gold bar that they owned was actual gold rather than some nickel or something else in the middle and just paint it, right, or had gold coating on it. And so right, there's a lot of issues with like I guess verifying whether or not the currency you have there is actually the currency, right? And then borrowing against it because it's too annoying to move and actually you can't pay for anything in gold, which is the opposite of Bitcoin, right? The Bitcoin is something that ultimately is usable. It's not just a store of value, right? It's also a unit of account and a medium of exchange. And so while you can say currently that Bitcoin it's not widely accepted and it's not something that I can really use, yeah, that's all fair and that's true right now. That's not necessarily true though in 5 or 10 years from now, and certainly not going to be the case in 30 years from now. So and somebody can call me in 30 years if they if I'm wrong, and I'm happy to say, okay, I'm sorry, I got the timing wrong. So but like gold, it's already proven that it doesn't work because like we would otherwise still be on the gold standard. But in 1971, we went off because it's so easy to go off, right? And so even these centrally housed gold places where people like you and me can go and store gold or whatever, we have no way of knowing if they're rehypothecating or what they're doing or if they have the gold. And so people are often saying that about, okay, if I store my Bitcoin on an exchange, right? We tell people not to do that, right? Take control of your keys, hold your own keys, not your Bitcoin, right? We have all of these tropes and memes and things because these things are true. If you're not sitting on the gold in your house, which is wildly inconvenient, then how do you know if you even have it? And it's the same thing with Bitcoin, right? We would never recommend that somebody store it on an exchange, or if they're going to store some on an exchange, have it be just a materially an unmaterial amount relative to your net worth and everything else that you have going on because you're like ready to move it or trade it or whatever. So I just think that these are just tried and true principles if you look back in time that it can't be the future, and if people are willing to have that conversation then they would see that it was true, right? And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is somebody's mind open to having this discussion or not? Because if they're not, then whatever, they're going to stay in their gold lane.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to look at the history of gold because it did so well for thousands of years, but it just had those weaknesses or the vulnerabilities that finally caught up to it. And it really just came down to, like you said, the exchange to the storage piece where, it's just a big hunky metal rock at the end of the day. And it becomes difficult to verify it and use it for money and, buy things with it. If you have to carry the stuff around, it's annoying. And Bitcoin comes in and I know some Bitcoiners hate that, this phrasing is used, but digital gold, and the Bitcoiners will say, "Oh, it's so much more than that. It has all these different things." But I like the digital gold framing because I think gold is really awesome, and there's a reason why it works so well for so long. But Bitcoin just upgrades it in a way, and it takes those weaknesses and it makes it better. And I'm curious if you would also, are you a fan of the digital gold phrasing when you're helping people understand why Bitcoin is like gold, but even more awesome?
Yeah, definitely. I think again it goes back to like who I'm talking to and what would resonate with them, right? Because ultimately everyone should own Bitcoin, right? What percentage that they own Bitcoin is going to be very, independent and relative to their personal situation, their needs, their objectives, their time horizon, right? Like what their family looks like, all the things, right? So, but at the end of the day, right, everyone can own $5 worth of Bitcoin, right? It's really easy to go and buy, a minimal amount or $10 or whatever it is and hold it in some sort of, even on a wallet, right? Even on a hot wallet on your phone, you can hold your $10. So I think like, when we're starting there, it's like, okay, how do we get people off zero, right? What's the tagline that's going to resonate with them? What's the narrative that's going to best help them be where they need to be? And I agree with you, right? For many years, there wasn't any alternative, right? Gold was the way. And people obviously use silver as well as, medium of exchange because it's cheaper and like easier to trade around and so forth. So like, the gold had its silver and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that just because something's around for a long time, right? A history doesn't necessarily mean that it has a future. And so, right, there has to be other reasons why that future sustains. And it's really obvious to me that Bitcoin's future is much brighter than gold's.
And one of the things that you talked about there, you brought up a couple times, this idea of diversification. And I'm curious to hear how your thoughts on diversification, which is the most classic, number one rule of personal finance is, oh, you need to be diversified. You need to have a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. And it's funny, we hear that in a lot of different places. On this podcast, I go into the diet realm too, like food, and they say the same thing. Oh, you have a little bit of everything in moderation. And this is kind of just this traditional advice that's given out, but it doesn't really seem to be the best option. How has Bitcoin changed your thoughts on diversification when you're talking to clients?
Yeah, I just love that question. Uh, so if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have given you a different answer. I would have probably still been in diversification camp. Um, I don't see Bitcoin as an investment. So I think that's like the place to start. So to me, Bitcoin is holding money. So if you're holding money, then it's not actually part of an asset allocation. What it is a currency allocation. So this sort of turns things on their head, right? Because like the average financial advisor, myself included, when we get an investment portfolio, yes, it does make sense to have a diversified investment portfolio. Okay, there's a lot of risks that go into both holding stocks and bonds or alternative investments or whatever it is. And in order to diversify away those risks and make sure that you don't lose everything that you have, right? You need to spread the risk. Essentially, that's what diversification is. That said, right? Before you even make investments, you have currency, right? You either have fiat or you have a choice of Bitcoin, or I guess if you wanted to put it into some sort of terrible other alt currency, that's your choice. I wouldn't even call those currencies, but I guess, some people like to do things like that, and that's, their own thing. So fiat or Bitcoin, right? Now you're deciding, okay, how much fiat do I need to have? How much Bitcoin do I need to have? And how much investment do I also want to have, right? It's a very different conversation. I think that this is going to be very difficult for regulators to understand because we're not quite there yet, because they still see Bitcoin as an investment, even though it's been deemed as a commodity by both the SEC and then also by the CFTC. So like we're in this weird place where it's called a commodity. It's not a commodity. It is a currency, right? And where like from an asset allocation standpoint, it's above the asset allocation, right? Like I have people who come in who, before we were even doing anything in Bitcoin, we were deciding how much cash, how much investment, right? And so when we're thinking about that, then it's like, okay, how much cash do I want to hold? How much long-term cash do I need? And how much short-term cash do I need? And then from there, do I actually need to have a bucket of investments? And so for most people, right, they're just going to need to have long-term cash and short-term cash. For some people, they're going to have maybe much more long-term cash and not very much short-term cash, right? And maybe they want something else in the middle because they just want to feel diversified, right? Or they have some midterm goals that don't necessarily align with long-term cash and short-term cash, in which case we might be able to build some sort of portfolio in the middle. That's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. And so I don't know if that necessarily answers your question about what the perfect portfolio is, but for most people, it's going to be emergency reserve in fiat and then Bitcoin basically for the rest. And then they can decide whether or not from there they actually want to make investments.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say another classic phrase that we love to use and you use as well is that you just need to get off zero Bitcoin. And this sort of as you talked about early in your story, how you're the type of person that just needs to get your feet wet and very gradually go into this thing. And I think that most people are the same. Most people are not crazy people like me who just, go all in on Bitcoin like crazy once you finally get it. And a lot of Bitcoiners do that. We're very famous for doing things such as selling our chairs so you can buy more Bitcoin, and selling your house so you can buy more Bitcoin.
Yeah.
These are all the memes that we love because it's just all about getting more and more Bitcoin, more Bitcoin. But for the people who are just getting started, talk about why it's so important to get off zero Bitcoin. And like you said, even just buy $5, $10, some small fraction just to get started. How does that mentally change someone? How does it financially shift them in a direction toward having a better form of money?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll give you an example. I think that best represents in 2020. So my business started in 2014. I started talking to people about Bitcoin in 2016. I spent from 2016, I was just sort of waiting for people to have questions about it because it was the regulatory environment was very unclear about what I could and couldn't say. So I didn't feel comfortable soliciting it as like an investment, quote unquote, right? It was kind of a no-go with my compliance department that I have. And so but if somebody came and had questions, then all of a sudden it was unsolicited, right? And I could say whatever I wanted. And so, and people did start to have questions. In 2016, they had questions. In 2017, with the run up, they had more questions. And in 2018, I got a lot of questions because they were like, well, it went up and went down. Like, should I be buying this thing? Like, what's going on? Some people were saying, should I own gold? Whenever anyone started bringing up gold, I'd be like, well, have you heard about this thing called Bitcoin? And so I would say from 2017 through 2019, I was fielding a lot of questions and I was trying to get people involved. And ultimately trying to do it in a way where if they brought up anything tangential, where I would just be like, oh, you're bringing about this thing, like let's talk about Bitcoin, and it worked. Like we got a lot of clients involved. In 2020 though, at one point when it was like I was not able to basically get everybody involved. We just had a blanket statement of, okay, if we can't get people to buy their own Bitcoin this year, we give them a 1 to 3% allocation to GBTC just based on net worth, risk tolerance, all the things, and looking at their specific situation, and people with very low risk tolerances, putting them in 1%, and people with higher risk tolerances, putting them in 3%, which now looking back on it, it's like, obviously I should have taken larger positions, but at the time, right, being conservative because I'm a financial planner. We had a lot of people get very excited though in 2020. The timing actually worked out. Like we hit it before like the run up that ended up happening. People were excited, and then all of a sudden, these people who had no interest at all were all of a sudden asking about buying Bitcoin outright. Right? They weren't caring about adding to GBTC. They wanted to know how they could own Bitcoin. And so we had a lot of clients at that point where we got them set up on multi-sig and hardware wallets and like getting them into like they opened up accounts on exchanges, and we walked them through how to move it. We walked them through test transactions, right? There was a lot of things that were able to occur just because they had that, $1,000 position in their account or whatever it is, right? And so I guess that's why I'm saying is like I've seen it work firsthand that if people get involved, it's a reason why we call it number go up technology, right? People get very excited when the number goes up, right? And then all of a sudden they get a lot more interested. I think the stakes are a lot higher now, right? Because of where Bitcoin's price is and where we are and so forth, that like it feels a lot more urgent to get people involved because it still feels early and it doesn't feel like it's exploded yet. And so for people like me who take 3 years to like get their head around things, like maybe they don't have 3 years, maybe you have to somehow accelerate it into 6 months or whatever it is. But getting people involved does work. And of all of my clients, I only had one client say, I don't want this, sell this out of my portfolio. So, I mean, that's really saying something that people, they want the alternative, right? I kind of like to compare, I don't know if you're religious or not, but I'm a believer in our creator. And it's the same thing I hear when people read the holy books, right? They are just starving for the information, whether they like it, whether they even know it or not. You give somebody one verse and all of a sudden they're like, I want to hear more. Like, what is this? Even if they don't care at all of a sudden it's like, we're starving for it. And I feel like Bitcoin is the same thing. Like people don't know that they need it or want it, but all of a sudden when they get a little bit of it, they're like, they need to know more. They want to be more involved.
Yeah, once you get that taste of it, it taps into something deep in your soul that you need this thing. It goes along with nature and what we're like meant to do and how we're meant to live our lives. And there's a super awesome movie and book. I haven't actually watched or read them yet, but thank God for Bitcoin. I'm sure you've heard of that. And that is just an awesome project that really helps all these folks who are on that side of things, like understand like Bitcoin is the money that God would want us to have. It goes along with all that. I'd love to talk about strategies for getting started. And I know that there are people listening right now that I'm sure have heard me ranting and raving about Bitcoin for a long time, but now that they get to hear a smart person talk about it, they might be ready for it. So, what are your thoughts on? Let's just start with this actually. When someone says, okay, I'm ready, I'm convinced, Bitcoin, let's do it. How do I get started? What do you tell them as the next steps for buying it, storing it, and sort of the quick start guide that you give them?
Yeah, definitely. So we typically send people to an exchange like River, just because Bitcoin only. Right, Swan would be another choice. It depends on what state they're in, obviously. Or like I have clients in New York, in which case it's just a no go, and they have to go to Coinbase, and that's just the way that it is. Right. We typically do try to send them to a Bitcoin only exchange, not because we don't think that they're going to go and buy Bitcoin, right, but just because like the interface is much easier to use, and there's only one option of what you're purchasing, right? And not that there's like trust, but there's just there's a little more level of trust of like, okay, for as long as my Bitcoin, like my fiat and my Bitcoin are going to be here, like it's probably going to be fine until I actually take self custody. From there, then we talk about like custody solutions. So for some people, right, it's single sig is going to be just fine. Depends on how much they have and how comfortable they are with storing both the seed plate and the hardware wallet. And we also discuss which hardware wallets and what would be appropriate, right? Because there's a wide variety of them, and some are more user friendly and some are less, but right, they're air gapped, like the cold card and so forth. And so I would say for most people starting out, cold card is probably not the way to go. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't change how you hold things in the future, but maybe if you're just starting out and you're not technologically savvy, that's not the right place to start. You're more likely to lose your Bitcoin than you are. You know what I mean? Like I feel like we're always trying to plan for all like the offshoot things like a wrench attack or something like that. And it's like for the average person who's just going to go buy like $20,000 worth of Bitcoin, right? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, it's more important that they figure out a way to store it where they feel comfortable and confident. And then from there, learn about all the other options rather than going right off the bat with like, the most complicated storage that they can come up with. So we're just gently guiding people in the direction where it makes sense for them personally to feel comfortable and confident. Because at the end of the day, right, if you don't feel confident in how you're storing Bitcoin, you're much more likely to actually sell it, not because you don't believe in it, but just because you're like, well, I'm going to lose it anyways, so I might as well keep it on an exchange or sell it or do whatever it is that I'm going to do. So from there, it's like, okay, then we direct either multi-sig, or there's other options like on-ramp where people can have like a multi-institutional depending on how much money they have. I would say for most people though, we're probably trying to get them into single sig and multi-sig just to start, depending on how much it is. And then once we get into these higher numbers, right, of hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, right, then we start talking like if they really are feeling uncomfortable with holding that in their home or wherever they're storing it, then we really need to start discussing about like what other options are available for somebody like that. So I hope that gives you kind of an overview of where we're.
Yeah, could you elaborate just slightly more on like the single sig and multi sig? What does that mean for people wondering like how it actually works?
Yeah. So for people who like basically I would say single sig is like the easiest thing to do, right? Like I think that people often think like, okay, well, it's there's a single point of failure, right? So obviously like maybe I don't necessarily want to store everything here or store everything eternally here. But for most people, that's going to be the easiest thing is you get one hardware wallet, right? You buy an exchange and you move it to that hardware wallet. For some people, they're also going to run their node, right? If they have a cold card and so forth, right? That's a little bit more advanced. But for the average person, right? If you get a Trezor and you go buy Bitcoin and you move it onto your single sig, then all you have to do is worry about finding a good storage place for your hardware wallet and finding a good storage place for your seed plate. And we always recommend that people store the seed plate in metal if they can. We've had some other interesting seed plate discussions where people didn't want to do the metal because they didn't think that it was as secure as, let's say, like other ideas that they have come up with. So I think you can also be creative in how you store your seed as long as you're not like putting it on the cloud. We don't tell people to do that, obviously, but it doesn't necessarily have to be metal if you've found some other interesting way of storing it. I would say for most people, it's just going to be the hardware wallet and the seed plate. And we always tell people with single sig that you store them separately, right? Because if you store that seed plate with the hardware wallet, right, then if it's found, then everything's done. Whereas if you're storing them separately, at least there's like some steps that somebody has to take if they find the seed plate to actually get your Bitcoin. And with the hardware wallet, right, they have to have the PIN and so forth. And usually people do engrave their PIN on their seed cards so that they don't forget it. So there's like a lot of reasons why you wouldn't want to store those things together. For a lot of people though, finding two places is very difficult. And so we often hear of people storing these things together, or they're not sure how often they have to check them, and then they store them in an even worse spot because they're like, okay, well, I was told I have to check this thing quarterly, so I might as well just keep it in my desk drawer because I have to keep checking it. And we're like, no, like just put it away, you know? So, and then like finding a trusted person, if you want to store it in a separate location, but it's at your friend's house, can I actually store my seed with them, right? There's all these things that come up when people start storing stuff. So I think that like the future of this is actually how to help people store this in a way that makes people feel secure, because ultimately single sig is the easiest, right? From there, though, if single sig for whatever reason is not working for somebody, that's when we step it up to multi-sig. And, you know, the thing that's nice about multi-sig, obviously, is that if you lose one hardware wallet or something malfunctions, right, you still have the two others where you can still make a transaction and you don't lose your Bitcoin. Whereas if you accidentally throw your hardware wallet in the trash can, then you don't want to be like going through the Staten Island dump with your little metal detector trying to find it.
Yeah, and just as an example for anyone that wants to go learn more about multi-sig, I know that in Austin, their Unchained Capital is a big one.
Yeah.
And plenty of other options out there too. Casa, I know, is another one. But these are basically ways to just add, you know, extra points of failure, like you said. And that's essentially what it comes down to is single sig, you just have one address, one wallet where it's fully yours. And multi-sig, it sort of expands your network. So you need to, in order for someone to steal your Bitcoin, they would need to get multiple addresses from multiple locations. So it just makes it more difficult. And everyone has a different, you know, place where they want to fall on that spectrum of convenience versus security.
Yeah.
So that's one of the cool things about Bitcoin. You can really just make it as secure as you want to. I know people that just, you know, have it just on a piece of paper somewhere and they just have like a difficult puzzle that only they would know how to solve. Or some people just memorize it, you know, and we hear examples of people who are escaping, you know, bad authoritarian regimes in third world countries who, you know, they learn about Bitcoin, they save their money in Bitcoin smartly, and they escape and they cross the border. And in the past, people would be completely robbed at the border and they would lose all their money and they would have to start at zero wherever they go. But with Bitcoin, they don't need to have anything. They don't even need to have a piece of paper. They can just memorize 12 words in their head. And then when they go to the next place, it's safer. They can then recover that Bitcoin and you're good to go.
Yeah,
So
I would insist on the recover part afterwards, because you never know what could happen to your head and then you actually lose your Bitcoin. So I hear people say that all the time, oh, I'll just memorize it and then I won't have to worry about storing any of these things. And it's like, okay, that's fine right now when you're 35, but you know, when you're 75, are you like repeating the words every single day? Like if you lost your marbles a little bit, you know?
yeah, I personally would never do that, but I guess there's some
I have trouble
situations.
remembering, you know, I mean, I have like permanent brain damage probably from having kids wake me up every single night for the last 7 years. So it's like, you know, that alone would be the reason not to have that stored in my head.
And then you can then upgrade. Once they're old enough, you can have each of your 3 kids memorize 4 words, and then you have a child multi-sig going on.
Yeah, I would say though the thing to insist with multi-sig, right, is that you can use these institutions, right? You can use something like Unchained Capital to help you, but also you can set it up on your own where you actually have all 3 keys and you only need 2 or 3 to sign. But just don't store them together. I mean, it seems like the obvious thing to say to people, and everyone says, yeah, I know. And then, you know, we talk to somebody and they're like, yeah, I have it together because I couldn't figure out another place to store it. And so it's like, there's no point. If you're just going to do that, just do single sig. Do you see what I mean? Right? There's no point in having this elaborate setup if at the end of the day, you're just going to store it the same way you store single sig. So I think like people need to just consider things like that of like their own personal abilities and what they're actually going to do rather than what influencers like me tell you to do on the internet. Not that I'm actually an influencer. Nobody cares what I say. Let's be honest.
You're good. You're a good influence. I think anyone that has good influence can still be called an influencer, but you're the good kind.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the actual buying amount. And we hear in Bitcoin a lot about lump sum versus dollar cost averaging. And for listeners, that's basically lump sum is like if you're just going to YOLO all of your cash into it, or dollar cost averaging, which DCA for short, is when you set up basically an interval. Either it could be a daily buy, a weekly buy, or a monthly buy of just a little bit over time. How do you introduce these two options, and which ones do you think would be best for which types of people for buying Bitcoin?
Yeah, so I think it really depends on how you get money. So, right, if you're earning money on a regular basis, you haven't received any kind of inheritance, you didn't get in any kind of accident where you got some kind of payout, right? You didn't get some sort of lump sum bonus. If you're just earning money and you're saving, 10 to 20% of your income, then DCA obviously is the right way to go, because as you get income, right, you shouldn't just accumulate fiat over time. You should just go and buy the Bitcoin when you get paid, and then use whatever's left over to pay your bills, feed your family, do everything else that you're doing. It's kind of traditional finance 101, is like pay yourself first, quote unquote. And I don't mean it into insurance policies like sometimes they often use it. I really mean it as like save your money before you go and do anything else. For a lot of people, that's just simply not what they do, right? They get the money in, they go and pay all the things that they're supposed to pay, and then whatever's left over, that's what they decide that they're going to save. And so I would say before you're even thinking about DCA versus lump sum, the first thing you actually have to do is just evaluate how much income do I have going out? How much do I have coming in? How much expenses do I have going out? What's the bottom line? And can I consistently decide to allocate to that? Because if you can, then DCA is the best way to go, because you just set up a draft, right? And then every month you invest $1,000 or whatever, save $1,000, excuse me, into Bitcoin, and you just move on with your life, and it's done. And then you move on and do the rest of your expenses, and pay whatever you need to pay. If you're finding that you're not able to save consistently over time, then you're going to end up in these situations where when you do have the cash, you have to make decisions of, okay, do I want to invest it now, or do I want to like save this for later? What am I thinking, or what am I doing? And I would say even in that situation, when you find that you have excess cash, you should save at that point in time. Don't wait. Don't try to time the market. Don't do any of these things. I see people make more mistakes from trying to time the market than they do from just putting it into Bitcoin and waiting. And it's the same thing I would say with lump sum versus DCA. If you do get an inheritance, typically what I recommend is that at least 50% of it goes into Bitcoin right away, of whatever it is that we were going to save in Bitcoin, just because like timing the market just doesn't work. And especially the more volatile an asset is, the more studies there are on people actually messing up and ending up with less. And so I think it's counterintuitive, because you think, okay, well, Bitcoin bounces around so much, so surely I should be able to time some down part. But what ends up happening is that Bitcoin starts to creep up and people are like, oh no, I might miss it, and then you just immediately buy the top, and then it, dips 10% right after. And I'm not saying this because like I don't do this, right? I have done this, right? If I just would have waited 2 days, then I would have gotten much more Bitcoin, right? And so I still think, even with data of people ending up better off trying to time, is that you don't know the future and you might end up worse off. And so just buy. From depending on how large, though, of let's say a lump sum, depending on how large a bonus might be, or how large an inheritance might be, or payout, or whatever it is that you get, like from there you can decide basically, do I like put 50% in right away? Do I put 100% in right away? Like 75%, right? Some of these decisions are just based on like how much it is, where like not really necessarily where the Bitcoin price is, but really like, do I even know how much of that capital I have to allocate?
Yeah, I would say, when I'm telling people what I think they should do on this, my advice has changed over time. Just the more crazy the world gets, and the more it just seems like all these major catalysts are so close. Like it's like that meme of the truck getting so close to that post over and over. It's like we're so close to things just really blowing up. I've sort of shifted toward, like if you have a decent stack of cash to invest, like I would definitely at least put a big chunk of it in right away.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if and just make sure that you have a long time horizon, because like you said, things can happen and there can be a big dip at any time. We see dips happen all the time. Just make sure that that won't wreck you, and don't use leverage. And if you're looking for at least, I don't know, how long would you say, 4 years is sort of your starting horizon, where people like should just completely pretend it doesn't exist for 4 years. And I think at this point, I would say I'd feel very confident that any 4 year period after buying now, you're going to be up. It's going to be very high likelihood. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use longer periods. I mean, we like to think of 10 years really as kind of a more longer term period of time. And so like any cash basically that somebody doesn't need for 10 years, just such an easy sell of like, okay, surely 10 years later, right? No matter where we buy today, you're going to be better off. And so I think that like, right, somehow when we get into some of these like lower time horizon numbers of like, okay, well, I was going to use some of this money to go buy a house in 1 to 2 years or whatever it is, right? Or even in 4 years, but you're not necessarily sure, right? You could still be on the cusp depending on when you put the money in, right? You could actually have a flat market where you put into Bitcoin it did all sorts of things in the middle, and then you ended up at the same price. So I guess like in some ways it's still a store of value, but not necessarily something that you're making more off of than you're going to go put into a house. So I think there's some of these discussions where you just have to decide, like, based on what you're looking to do and your time horizon, right, what makes the most sense. But in general, yeah, I agree with you. If you've got cash and you've got a long time horizon, I don't see why you would have it sit in fiat, unless, of course, like you were on the opposite spectrum where you just didn't carry any fiat and you weren't worried about any kind of emergency reserve, right? And for some reason you ended up with some lump sum. At that point, I would actually evaluate what kind of emergency fund makes sense for you and your family. Because like ultimately what I've seen happen to people, and people don't like to talk about this, right? People like to talk about the success stories of how they have zero fiat and now they're a trillionaire or whatever it is, right? They don't like to talk about the fact that they had zero emergency reserve and they actually had to go sell their Bitcoin to pay a large tax bill, to go buy a new boiler, to go fix the transmission on their car, right? I hear a lot of those stories in my own practice because, right, like I see the nitty gritty of what's going on, but you don't hear about those stories on the internet because no one tells you like the dumb mistake that they made and why they have, only 3 Bitcoin instead of 5. Or whatever it is, right? So nobody likes to admit these things. And so I think like first principles of finance, yeah, these make sense of like, okay, have some sort of fiat reserve so that when things come up, and they will come up, right? And they don't necessarily come up every single year, that you don't actually have to go sell your Bitcoin to go fix whatever it is that actually happened. And, I hope that won't happen to people, obviously, but that's just not the case. Like you can't expect that nothing like you're gonna have no uncertainty in your life. That's just not reality. And I think that we always like we need to live on reality's terms, and that applies also to future price predictions. I often see this with Bitcoiners of like, well, it's inevitable. Bitcoin's going to be, $1 million a coin. So I don't have to worry about all the stuff that you're talking about. And it's going to take over the fiat system. And we're not going to have the IRS anymore. And, estate planning laws aren't going to matter anymore and all this stuff. And it's like, okay, but all this stuff actually matters today, right? We need to live in the reality of today. We could still have all these lofty, examples of what's going to happen in the future and be excited about the future, right? And have hope. But and hopefully we do all live in that world in 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it is, right? But in the meantime, right, you still need to plan for today because things can happen today and you want to be prepared.
Yeah, it's a balance because you don't want to sink yourself with, by being just too focused on the future. And I sometimes find myself pulled in that direction myself if I just think so far in the future where I have to stop myself like, Ben, you got to relax. We still live in this system that sucks. You have to play these games sometimes. And it's good to have a balance because I'm definitely much more hopeful for the future because I do see a much better future when we're on that sound money standard. And I think that this is also a good tool for helping people understand why, buying Bitcoin is literally good for your mental health.
Yeah, for sure. And
do you ever talk about that with people in your practice at all? I mean, we see this so
one more thing
common.
Before I talk about mental health. So to put this into perspective to people, what people are doing in Bitcoin, imagine you have, you get married and you have a child, okay? And the child is 3 months old. They've just rolled over. And all you talk about with your wife is who they're going to get married to and what it's going to be like when they're married with their own kids. Right? Like that's what it is when we're projecting out this amazing future that we don't know anything about. But like, instead of enjoying the moment of my son just rolled over, I'm now talking about what he's going to be doing when he's 28 and going to be married to somebody random. You know what I mean? Like it just doesn't make sense. And so I think when we talk about these kinds of examples, right, all of a sudden it puts into perspective. Yeah, that's crazy. Like, of course I wouldn't be thinking about that, right? Because why would I? But like we all, and I'm guilty of this too, right? Of like what it would be like living in this Bitcoin world. Like, the reality is that, yeah, it's going to hopefully be a much better life than it is today. And I have great hopes for my kids that like when they have kids, that their kids won't have complete garbage toys from China, that will have nicely made things that don't break all the time. And that I won't have to replace things like my toaster every 10 years. Like of course I think about those things too, but like also, we need to live in reality, obviously. And reality is not so bad either, right? Like where we live today, it could have been a lot worse. We could be living, 1,000 years ago where, people just died because there was a plague, right? Like things are like, if we put into perspective of like the difference between what things were back then versus where they are now versus where they will be, right? I think that like ultimately why we're here is to make the best of what of our current situation, right? And we were placed in a specific time, in a specific place, with a specific family, right? To make the best of today and to make the world a better place. And I think, like, to answer your question about mental health, then kind of all that stuff melts away, right? If you know that you're here for a purpose and you're supposed to be here in this time, in this place, doing whatever it is that you're doing, right? And making the most of your life here, and trying to make the world a better place in whatever way you can, right? And Bitcoiners are really idealistic, right? We're all doing this because we want the world to be a better place. We're not doing this because we just want to have yachts, you know? I mean, I think that there are some people, obviously, that are doing that. But most people, I would say, like, are very
more of a crypto thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely more of a crypto thing. And most Bitcoiners I know are very ideological. They want a better future. They want to, like, you know, have the nuclear family and have all of these, you know, have like a more meaningful and intentional life. And you can have that today without living in a Bitcoin world. And when you're thinking about how you're living your life, like, a lot of that can just melt away. You don't need to have that anxiety about everything if you're just doing what you're supposed to be doing right now.
100%. And we see this so many times just when we go to meetups and conferences with a bunch of Bitcoiners. They really do fit that mold of people that are really excited about the future and passionate about building the future and having lots of babies and doing all these long-term things. Because when you look at the people who are pessimistic about the future and it's sort of these fiat NPCs, as we call them, they're just kind of walking around and they're just depressed and unhappy and have no hope for the future for all the reasons that we've talked about. It's just becoming harder to live for so many people. So when you find Bitcoin, it sends you in all sorts of more positive directions, and it gets you into more rabbit holes that are not just cope. You know, it's actual real solutions are being built here that are going to fix this. And we know that there are going to be quite turbulent times between now and then. Like, there's never been a perfectly smooth monetary transition before. It could get ugly, but we're holding the thing that's going to get us through it. Would you agree?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think just sound money alone and also caring about the next generation. One of the issues that we're having right now is that we have terrible money and a lot of politicians that don't have children, right? So, like, not only is the money just terrible, and as a result, like, there's just downstream of that, just complete depravity and corruption and terrible things happening, right? And then, like, these people aren't having children also because it doesn't seem that important to even care about the next generation, because why bother if, like, the climate is, you know, if temperatures are rising to 1,000,000 degrees, you know, I don't believe this stuff, but I'm just saying, like, the narratives out there is that the earth is going to be on fire in an hour. The money is worthless, right? Everyone's on drugs. We don't know what genders we are, right? Like, we're in this world where it's like, why bother? Why do anything for the next generation? So we might as well just print lots of money and just do whatever we're doing right now today. And then, you know, who cares? Whereas, like, if we've got, right, sound money where we can think more in the future about, like, planning and how we're going to be, you know, raising families and how we can think about society in general, right? Now, all of a sudden, the next generation matters. And what we do today has an effect on the next generation, instead of just kicking the can down the road because, you know, why not? And who cares about the next people? Because I'm not even going to have kids anyways. So somebody else's kids will deal with whatever I'm doing today, right? The mentality is very different. And so, yeah, of course, it's going to be I think at the end of the day, right, it just comes back to freedom versus responsibility. So often when people think of freedom, they think, I want to do whatever I want to do, and I want to do it now. And that's not actually freedom, right? If we think about all sorts of things in our lives, these things have rules and responsibilities that actually give you freedom. So for instance, like when you're driving on a road, if anyone had the freedom to go anywhere at any time on any road without any road signs or traffic rules or so forth, right? No one would actually be able to get anywhere because everyone would be crisscrossing and cutting each other off and trying to get somewhere. It would just be a big traffic jam, or worse, many accidents, right? And so having rules on the road enable us to have the freedom to get where we want to go, right? Same thing with, like, you play baseball or basketball, right? You wouldn't have a game if you didn't have rules. You can't play baseball if you don't have rules of baseball. You can't play basketball if you don't have rules of basketball. These games don't exist, right? So in any part, in every aspect of society, having rules actually helps us have the freedom to do what it is that we want to do. And so it's the same thing with the money, right? If we're just willy-nilly printing money and we have the freedom to print and do whatever we want, right? We have absolute chaos. But when we have responsibility with our money, because our money is sound and our money is going to provide for us for many, many generations, right? We have rules around how we store our money and what we do with our money and how we're going to save and spend and where we're going to put it and what we're thinking about in terms of what we need now versus what we need later, right? All of a sudden, we have all of this freedom that opens us up to actually having the life that we want to have.
one of the pieces you mentioned there that is one of my last questions I have circled here I'd love to ask you is regarding how different people have different mindsets regarding, the future, and how important you make it that you leave a good future for next generations. And I think this has become a hot topic of talking about how like the baby boomers and the millennials and the Gen Z all sort of fit into this puzzle. And I assume you're a millennial, I'm a millennial,
I am.
and I think it's become more within the Overton window to say, you know what, the baby boomers kind of screwed us here. Like this, it seems like their generation kind of didn't really give us a better hand than they had. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. I know it's a little bit of a spicy topic, but to settle it, I mean, how would you break down the hands that have been dealt to each generation from baby boomer to millennials to Gen Z to maybe Gen Alpha? And because I think that this is important for those young people out there to understand that if you're struggling right now, it's not your fault completely. Like not to say that you don't have any responsibility for yourself, but you know, to be fair, like you've been given a worse hand. Would you agree with that? And how would you break that all down?
I think people are going to hate my response, but I'm going to tell you it anyways. And feel free to send me hate mail because I stand by this. So you like getting back to what we were saying, right? Every single person was put where they need to be. That's my belief, and I know that to be true because that's just the way that it is, right? We are born to do a certain thing in a certain time in a certain body with a certain family with a certain circumstances, right? And we can keep going out and out to all the layers on this, but you are exactly where you need to be. If you were given a worse hand than the generation before you and the generation before that, that's because you were the one to fix it, not because you should have been in a better situation, right? And if you were in a situation where you were supposed to make it worse and you did, then you did your job, right? I think that that's ultimately like, yes, we have free will. And yes, like we can make decisions about what we do, right? So it's actually what we do with that hand, like you were saying with responsibility, right? If you were dealt a bad hand, fine. There are plenty of people that have been dealt bad hands and they do great things, right? If you were dealt a good hand, there are plenty of people that have been dealt good hands and actually completely mess it up and make all sorts of bad decisions, even though they had the platter right in front of them. And the only thing that they had to do was pick up the fork, right? But instead, what do? They hit the platter, right? And so like, I just think that like we have so much choice in how we handle our circumstances that we can spend our lives feeling badly about the situation that we're in and what happened before us, or we can choose to make lemonade with lemons, right? I tell this to my kids all the time when they have issues. I'm like, okay, well, we can sulk here in the corner about how it's not fair and, like how you wish you had this when somebody else has that and how like, all these things, or we can be very grateful for all the gifts that we've been blessed with. And it really does come down to like acknowledging that. I think that's really hard for people. It's so easy to spot the thing that's wrong, and it's so hard to acknowledge all of the things that are right and what we can do with the things that are right rather than focusing in on what's wrong.
I love that answer. That's amazing. And such a great way to end this, I think, is just that this mindset that to not get down on yourself for the situation is happening. Because I know for a lot of people out there, it's hard. And a lot of people listening to this will be in a tough space. Even a lot of us Bitcoiners, we're stacking sats, but we still have to deal with the fiat world, Yeah, just because Bitcoiners have this knowledge of what the future is going to be like doesn't mean it's not difficult for everybody. So very good message of hope there, and appreciate you sharing it. So Morgen, where can people go to find more of your work and order your book and get all this good stuff that you're working on?
Yeah, for sure. So you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Morgen with an E, Rochard, E instead of an A. My husband and I have a podcast. It's called Bitcoin for Advisors. We try to get them out monthly, but I'll be honest, we usually get like 7 to 8 out per year. So we're doing our best with that. But it's similar to this where we just chit chat and we talk about Bitcoin. Will be speaking at Bitcoin 2025. So if anyone wants to check me out there, Pierre and I are doing a fireside chat there. We'd love to see people. If you need financial planning, feel free to come to originwa.com. That's my financial planning firm. And then if you just need some consulting, it's moneyowners.com. My book's on Amazon. I'm working on another book. It's really slow going. I regret announcing that I was doing a book like while I was pregnant with my third, because I really had it in my mind, because I wrote my first book while I was pregnant with my second. And I was like, I jammed that out in 3 months. It's a lot harder to jam out a book when you already have two kids. I just sort of had it in my mind of like, I write stuff when I'm pregnant. I'm totally prolific. And yeah, no, I've been very humbled by that. So I'm still working on that book, but I'm about halfway through. It's specifically about Bitcoin personal finance, though. My other book is more of a general overview about personal finance. The Bitcoin section is very small because my publisher made me make it small. And also, I think that Bitcoiners, when they read it, they can sort of elaborate on how the traditional financial concepts would apply to them specifically when they're holding Bitcoin. So maybe you don't need to spend too much time in the investments chapter, but spend some time in other places in that book, because all of that stuff is still relevant.
Excellent. Well, I will be sure to put all those links in the show notes for people to check out. I'm looking forward to that book, and I'll see you in Las Vegas because this is my first year I'll also be speaking, so I'm very much looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun time with lots of cool Bitcoiners, and anyone out there looking to go meet some cool people, come. It's going to
Yeah.
be super cool. That's a great place to go, just get deeper into the Bitcoin rabbit hole no matter where you are. So highly recommend it. Morgen Rochard, I appreciate you so much for coming to join me today. Thank you so much for talking with me, and I look forward to sharing this with my audience.
Thanks, Ben. It was great having me on. Thank you.